Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, whose leadership during World War I and visionary creation of the League of Nations left an indelible mark on global history, was born Thomas Woodrow Wilson on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia, into a devout Presbyterian family, with his father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, a prominent minister and theologian who instilled in him a deep sense of moral purpose and intellectual rigor, and his mother, Janet Woodrow Wilson, nurturing his early education in a household that valued scholarship and faith above all. Growing up in the post-Civil War South, young Woodrow witnessed the ravages of Reconstruction firsthand, as his family moved to Augusta, Georgia, and later Columbia, South Carolina, where his father's roles in Presbyterian seminaries exposed him to debates on theology, politics, and society, shaping his idealistic worldview that would later define his political career. Struggling with dyslexia in his youth, Wilson did not learn to read until age 10, but he compensated with a voracious appetite for learning, teaching himself shorthand and devouring books on history and oratory, idolizing figures like British Prime Minister William Gladstone for their eloquence and principled leadership. At the age of 16, he enrolled at Davidson College in North Carolina, but withdrew after a year due to health issues, later transferring to the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, where he immersed himself in debate clubs and political science, graduating in 1879 with a passion for reforming American government to make it more efficient and democratic. Inspired by the parliamentary systems of Europe, Wilson pursued legal studies at the University of Virginia, but abandoned law practice after a brief stint in Atlanta, finding it unfulfilling, and instead earned a Ph.D. in political science from Johns Hopkins University in 1886, the only U.S. president to hold a doctorate, with his dissertation Congressional Government, critiquing the American system's inefficiencies and advocating for a stronger executive branch akin to a prime minister. His academic career flourished as he taught at Bryn Mawr College, Wesleyan University, and eventually returned to Princeton in 1890 as a professor of jurisprudence and political economy, captivating students with his dynamic lectures on democracy, ethics, and governance, and publishing influential works like The State and A History of the American People, which established him as a leading intellectual of the progressive era, a time when reformers sought to curb corruption, regulate big business, and expand social justice. In 1902, Wilson was unanimously elected president of Princeton University, where he implemented bold reforms, including replacing the eating clubs with residential quadrangles to democratize campus life, introducing a preceptorial system for small group discussions, and attempting to integrate graduate education more closely with undergraduates. Though these changes sparked fierce opposition from alumni and faculty, honing his skills in political maneuvering, but also revealing his stubborn idealism that sometimes alienated allies. Amid growing national prominence, Wilson entered politics in 1910 when New Jersey Democrats, seeking a progressive candidate to counter machine politics, nominated him for governor, and he won handily, surprising many by breaking from party bosses and pushing through reforms like direct primaries, workers' compensation laws, and regulations on public utilities, positioning himself as a champion of the common man against entrenched interests. His gubernatorial success catapulted him to the Democratic presidential nomination in 1912, a fractious convention where he emerged after 46 ballots, campaigning on his New Freedom platform that promised to dismantle monopolies, lower tariffs, and empower small businesses, capitalizing on the Republican split between incumbent William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party to win the election with 42% of the popular vote, becoming the first Southerner elected president since Zachary Taylor in 1848. Taking office on March 4, 1913, Wilson hit the ground running with an ambitious domestic agenda, delivering his inaugural address in person to Congress, a practice not seen since John Adams, and convening a special session to pass the Underwood Tariff Act, which slashed rates and introduced the first federal income tax under the newly ratified 16th Amendment, fulfilling his pledge to make trade more competitive. He followed this with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating a central banking system to stabilize the economy and prevent panics like that of 1907, a compromise that blended public and private control and remains a cornerstone of U.S. financial policy. Wilson's progressive reforms continued with the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which strengthened protections against monopolies and exempted labor unions from antitrust laws, and the Federal Trade Commission Act, establishing an agency to investigate unfair business practices, all while he navigated personal tragedy with the death of his first wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, in August 1914, a loss that plunged him into deep grief, but did not halt his legislative momentum. As Europe plunged into war in July 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Wilson proclaimed American neutrality, urging citizens to be impartial in thought as well as in action, a stance rooted in his moral aversion to militarism and belief that the U.S. should serve as a mediator for peace, though economic ties with the Allies and German submarine warfare tested this policy. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, killing 128 Americans, intensified calls for preparedness, leading Wilson to authorize a modest military buildup while campaigning for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," narrowly defeating Republican Charles Evans Hughes by winning California in a razor-thin margin, becoming the first Democrat re-elected since Andrew Jackson. In his second term, Wilson pursued further reforms, including the Adamson Act for an 8-hour workday on railroads and the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, though the latter was struck down by the Supreme Court. But global events soon overshadowed domestic achievements as Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, coupled with the Zimmermann telegram proposing a Mexican alliance against the U.S., eroded neutrality. On April 2, 1917, Wilson addressed Congress, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy, and 4 days later, the U.S. declared war on Germany, marking America's entry into World War I, a conflict Wilson framed not as vengeance, but as a crusade for a new world order based on self-determination and collective security. As Commander-in-Chief, Wilson mobilized the nation with unprecedented efficiency, overseeing the Selective Service Act that drafted over 2.8 million men, appointing General John J. Pershing to lead the American Expeditionary Forces, and implementing wartime controls through agencies like the War Industries Board under Bernard Baruch and the Committee on Public Information under George Creel, which propagated pro-war sentiment while suppressing dissent via the Espionage and Sedition Acts, leading to over 2,000 prosecutions, including that of socialist Eugene V. Debs. Wilson's administration also saw the nationalization of railroads and a massive propaganda effort to sell Liberty bonds, raising billions for the war effort. While on the home front, the Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities accelerated, though racial tensions erupted in riots like those in East St. Louis in 1917, exposing the limits of Wilson's progressive vision, as he maintained segregation in federal offices and remained silent on lynching despite pleas from civil rights leaders. On the battlefield, American doughboys arrived in France in 1917, tipping the balance in 1918 with decisive victories at Belleau Wood, Château-Thierry, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, contributing to the German collapse and the armistice on November 11, 1918, ending the war that claimed over 116,000 American lives. In January 1918, Wilson outlined his 14 points, a blueprint for peace that called for open diplomacy, free trade, arms reduction, self-determination for oppressed peoples, and, crucially, a League of Nations to prevent future wars, a visionary proposal that captured global imagination but faced skepticism from Allied leaders focused on punishing Germany. Sailing to Europe in December 1918 aboard the USS George Washington, Wilson became the first sitting president to visit the continent, receiving rapturous welcomes in Paris, London, and Rome as a harbinger of a new era. But at the Paris Peace Conference, he clashed with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando, who demanded harsh reparations and territorial gains, forcing Wilson to compromise on many points to secure the inclusion of the League of Nations Covenant in the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the Sarajevo assassination. Returning home, Wilson faced fierce opposition in the Senate, led by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, who demanded reservations to protect U.S. sovereignty, but Wilson's intransigence, "I will not consent to the adoption of any policy which will impair the covenant," led to a deadlock, and in a desperate bid to rally public support, he embarked on a grueling 8,000-mile speaking tour in September 1919, delivering 37 speeches in 22 days, warning that without the League, there will be another war. Within a generation. Exhausted, Wilson suffered a massive stroke on October 2, 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, leaving him partially paralyzed and secluded in the White House, where his second wife, Edith Balling Galt Wilson, whom he married in 1915, managed access to him, effectively acting as a gatekeeper in what some called a petticoat government. Though she denied making decisions on his behalf, the Senate rejected the treaty twice, in November 1919 and March 1920, isolating the U.S. from the League it had inspired. A bitter defeat that overshadowed Wilson's final year in office, marked by economic recession and the Red Scare, with Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's raids on suspected radicals. Retiring to a Washington home in March 1921, Wilson lived quietly until his death on February 3, 1924, at age 67, from another stroke, his dream of collective security unrealized in his lifetime but prescient, as the League's weaknesses contributed to the rise of fascism and World War II, though it laid the groundwork for the United Nations. Wilson's legacy is complex. Hailed as a progressive reformer who advanced women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920 and labor rights, yet criticized for his racial policies, including screenings of the pro-Klan film, The Birth of a Nation, at the White House and his administration's segregationist practices, which alienated African-American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois. His internationalism, embodied in the League, positioned the U.S. as a global leader, influencing future presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Harry Truman, and his emphasis on moral diplomacy endures in debates over American foreign policy, reminding us that ideals, when pursued with conviction, can reshape the world even amid compromise and tragedy. To fully appreciate Wilson's intellectual foundations, consider how his Presbyterian upbringing fostered a belief in predestination and moral absolutism, often manifesting in his rigid negotiating style, or how his early essays on statesmanship emphasized eloquence as a tool for persuasion, a skill he deployed masterfully in speeches like his 1917 war message to Congress, which blended idealism with pragmatism to unite a divided nation. During the war, Wilson's administration revolutionized federal power, with the Overman Act granting him broad authority to reorganize executive agencies, and the Food Administration under Herbert Hoover rationing supplies to feed Allied troops, innovations that set precedents for New Deal-era expansions. The 14 points, articulated in a January 1918 address, not only proposed the League, but also advocated for the dissolution of empires, influencing the redrawing of Europe's map and the independence of nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia, though Wilson's concessions at Versailles, such as allowing Japan to retain Shandong and Italy to gain territories, sowed seeds of resentment that fueled future conflicts. His stroke, which left him with limited vision in one eye and paralysis on his left side, highlighted the personal toll of leadership, as he refused to resign despite calls from some cabinet members, insisting on fulfilling his term, a decision that strained the government during critical post-war negotiations. In retirement, Wilson briefly practiced law with former Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby and received visitors like a young Franklin D. Roosevelt, offering counsel on international affairs, while his final public appearance in 1923, Armistice Day, saw him weekly addressing a crowd from his doorstep, reaffirming his faith in the League. Historians rank Wilson among the top-tier presidents for his transformative domestic reforms, including the creation of the Federal Trade Commission to curb unfair competition and the Child Labor Act, though overturned, which paved the way for later protections, and his wartime leadership that mobilized an isolationist nation into a world power, producing over 4 million troops and vast material that turned the tide against the Central Powers. Yet, his record on civil liberties draws scrutiny, as the Espionage Act led to the imprisonment of critics like Debs, who received nearly 1 million votes for president from his cell in 1920, and the Palmer raids deported hundreds without due process, reflecting the era's paranoia over Bolshevism following the Russian Revolution. Wilson's vision for the League of Nations, an assembly of nations to arbitrate disputes and enforce peace through collective action, anticipated modern multilateralism, though U.S. absence weakened it, leading to failures like the inability to stop Japan's invasion of Manchuria or Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. In cultural memory, Wilson is portrayed in films like Wilson, in 1944, which romanticized his idealism, and more critically in recent scholarship examining his racist views, prompting re-evaluations such as Princeton's 2020 decision to remove his name from its public policy school due to his segregationist policies. Nevertheless, his eloquent advocacy for democracy, as in his 1918 message to Congress declaring war aims, continues to inspire, with phrases like "peace without victory" echoing in contemporary diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson's life, from his scholarly beginnings to his tumultuous presidency, embodies the tension between high ideals and harsh realities, a leader who sought to bend the arc of history toward justice, but often found himself constrained by the very human frailties he aimed to transcend, leaving a legacy that challenges us to balance moral conviction with pragmatic compromise in the pursuit of a better world. Delving deeper into his personal life, Wilson's marriage to Ellen Axon in 1885 produced 3 daughters, and her influence softened his stern demeanor, while his 1915 remarriage to Edith Galt brought companionship during his trying second term, though it fueled rumors of undue influence. His health had long been fragile, with earlier bouts of neuritis and headaches foreshadowing his 1919 collapse, which some attribute to the immense stress of Paris negotiations, where he contracted influenza amid the global pandemic that killed millions, including in the U.S. under his watch. Economically, Wilson's policies fostered wartime prosperity, but led to post-war inflation and strikes, like the 1919 steel and coal walkouts, which he resolved through mediation, reflecting his belief in arbitration over confrontation. On the international stage, his support for the mandate system assigned former colonies to Allied oversight, a halfway measure towards self-rule that influenced decolonization, while his recognition of new republics in Eastern Europe redrew the map, but ignored ethnic complexities that erupted in later conflicts. The Senate's rejection of Versailles, driven by isolationists and Lodge's reservations, marked a pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy, delaying American global engagement until World War II. Yet Wilson's ideas triumphed posthumously with the UN's founding in 1945, incorporating many League principles. In education, his Princeton reforms modernized curricula, emphasizing liberal arts over classics, a model adopted by universities nationwide, while his writings on constitutional government advocated for presidential leadership in policymaking, influencing the imperial presidency concept. Critics note his interventionist policies in Latin America, sending troops to Mexico in 1914, occupying Haiti in 1915, and intervening in the Dominican Republic in 1916, actions justified as promoting democracy, but often seen as imperial overreach. Domestically, his appointment of Louis Brandeis as the first Jewish Supreme Court justice in 1916 broke barriers, and his wartime speeches rallied diverse immigrant populations, though anti-German hysteria led to cultural suppressions like banning Beethoven's music. As the war ended, Wilson's call for a peace of justice contrasted with Allied vindictiveness, and his personal diplomacy at Paris, negotiating directly rather than through delegates, exhausted him but underscored his commitment. In his final message to Congress in 1920, he lamented the treaty's failure but predicted America's eventual return to internationalism, a prophecy fulfilled in the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson's story is one of triumph and tragedy, a scholar-president whose intellect illuminated paths to progress, but whose inflexibility sometimes dimmed them, reminding future leaders that vision must be tempered with humility to endure.